Today on CityCast DC, Tracey Hadden Loh runs a program at Brookings that compiles economic data about the DC area, which means she tends to be a step ahead when it comes to noticing, blinking danger signs about how our region is doing. As you can imagine, her phone has been ringing off the hook in this past year of DOGE and dislocation. Luckily for us, she answered when we called, and she's here today to share some new data about a weird plunge in DMV consumer spending and what it might mean for you and me. Today is Wednesday, January 14th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Tracey Hadden Loh, welcome back.
It's great to be back. Thanks for having me, Mike.
So you all at the Brookings Institution started releasing these DMV monitor reports, and you've got the second one out now. As the name suggests, you guys are monitoring how the DMV is doing economically. I talked to you for the first one at the time. Things didn't look great. And things getting better, worse, same?
Things can always get worse, Mike.
But have they?
Yes, unfortunately.
So let's break this down. This report focuses on consumer spending, which is down quite significantly. Just precisely what is this a measure of?
What we did was we obtained a pretty unique data set of credit card transactions. So just to be clear, it's only when we say consumer spending, our data set is just people using credit cards. And then we looked at credit cards that are being used to make purchases at businesses that are physically located with an address that's in the DMV metro area. So not just going on Amazon and buying something.
Okay, so a lot of people have, including me, spend less in stores and more on Amazon now. How much of this drop-off is attributed to that, and how much is attributed to stuff that that's just a matter of my changing habits. But if I lost my job, I might stop spending money everywhere. How can you tease out the two things?
So what we can do is look at national trends in terms of the share of consumer spending that is e-commerce. That is publicly available data. And that share increased only a little bit between 2024 and 2025. If you think about your own shopping habits, the big surge in the amount that the share of spending that you did online, that probably happened a ways back. There was probably a big jump when Amazon Prime first got really easy to use. And then you probably had another really big jump during the pandemic when a lot of stores were closed and people were trying to avoid physical contact. There's actually been a decline in the share of spending that's online since the peak during the pandemic.
All right. But consumer spending in the Washington area dropped off, and pretty significantly. How much did it fall? And I know it varied by jurisdictions within the area.
Yeah. So I want to be clear that in the region as a whole, consumer spending is up. If we just look at all the consumer spending that happened in 2025 and compare it to 2024. And that's what we would expect. Generally, consumer spending has been growing year to year for a while. It's a national trend. It's a holistic trend. But it was when we started to break it down into different categories, such as looking at the spending that's happening in specific jurisdictions, and then also comparing the consumer spending of residents of the DMV to the consumer spending of visitors to the DMV, that we started to see some negative trends.
So what are some of these things telling you?
So first, we saw that there was a significant drop in visitor spending in specific jurisdictions where visitor spending is really important. Right. So if visitor spending is less than 10% of all the spending that's happening in your county, maybe you're not worried too much about it.
That's a third in DC.
Yeah, it's a third of all of the spending that happens in DC. And in both the District of Columbia and Montgomery County, what we saw is that there was a huge decline in visitor spending.
Like how much?
In actual millions of dollars, it was down relative to the 2022 level. It was down 2% in the district and 10% in Montgomery County. But if we look at just the change from 2024 to 2025, we're talking about a loss of approximately $20 million in spending. And given that the annual spend is like $100 million in 2024, that's a really big cliff to fall in a single year.
And this is telling you that fewer tourists or conventioneers or whatever are coming to the DC area.
I think it's not just about the number of visitors, but also how much is being spent per visit. So what we know from the kind of market research that Destination DC and other trade organizations have done is that there are very different kinds of visitors to the district. International tourists, in particular, are some of the highest spending visitors to the district. And so a big drop off in a really small category of visitation can have an outsized impact on total spend if those were the big spenders, the high rollers.
And is the theory here that international visitors are less likely to want to come here because there's all these stories about people being given a hard time at immigration?
I mean, I think that that's very possible. I think also a lot of the international visitation to the city is driven by business, right? Like this is where the World Bank is, et cetera. And so maybe it just has to do with the volume of business that's happening at international institutions within the city. Our credit card data set is actually just domestic spending. What I want to emphasize here is that the real decline in spending is probably way bigger than what we showed in our report because it doesn't include these high spending international travelers. That $20 million decline in spend in real dollars between 2024 and 2025 in the district, that's just driven by domestic visitors.
And that's real. So that plus whatever we're not getting from foreigners. I did a political column about the number of international meetings that have canceled.
Yeah.
Because the people putting on the meetings are worried they'll lose money since they're worried that these overseas visitors won't want to come.
I think that's a concern. And then I think also our data set included all of the first 3 quarters of 2025. So it stopped right before the government shutdown. But I think there probably was more loss during the government shutdown because there were meetings that were canceled just because the host of the meeting was closed.
So bottom line is that drop-off alone, just the people who don't live here, indicates less money in the coffers of local governments for schools or playgrounds or whatever they spend money on.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest fiscal impact is going to be to the District of Columbia, the state of Maryland, and the Commonwealth of Virginia, because sales tax revenue is, in the top 3 revenue sources for all of those jurisdictions. At the local level, there will be some impact in Virginia because they do have they do some sales tax sharing in Virginia. That is not done in Maryland, and that's where a lot of the drop off in spend was. So I think the worst impacts would be in the district and then in counties in Northern Virginia.
Don't miss Folger Theater's 4th annual Reading Room Festival on stage January 22nd through the 25th at the Folger Shakespeare Library. Join us as we collaboratively re-envision Shakespeare's works, explore the vibrant musicality of Shakespeare's verses, and reimagine the stories crafted by other early modern playwrights in this 4-day festival of staged readings, panel discussions, workshops, and community celebrations. This year's lineup features works from Alexa Babakania, Alberto Bonilla, Barbara Fuchs, and Marcus Gardley, with Arena Stage's artistic director, Hannah S. Sharif, directing one staged reading. Celebrate the spirit of collaborative theater making and community with the Folger. Enjoy all the festival has to offer for only $125 by purchasing an all-access pass at folger.edu/readingroom. Get yours today.
And then there's the question of people who live here or lived here. Obviously, there was a huge number of job losses among federal workers and among people who work for government contractors in the DOGE period and beyond. The Post reported 72,000 federal job losses in the D.C. region. And a lot of people presumably scared about losing their jobs and being a little bit more careful with money in the meantime. What are we seeing among people who live here? Because you said that that's a different beast.
Yeah. So I want to be clear that like what individual households are going through is real, but this credit card spending is aggregate, right? This is all households. And so what we saw when we broke down DMV resident spending month by month in 2025 and compared it to 2024, in the first half of the year, for the most part, spending in real dollars was up. So while what those households are going through is real, there were a lot of other households where the desire to consume was, or the need to consume was sustained.
So that's the first half of the year. But then in the summer, we had the law enforcement take over, the National Guard. I know I heard anecdotally from people who operate restaurants, as well as I think stats from the Restaurant Association, this led to a real chilling of people's desire to go out.
I think people have a natural skepticism of the facts and figures that come from industry groups and trade associations because, obviously, like they're representing a specific interest and, they have a narrative that they want to advance. But, I'm coming to this data set from like just a completely nonpartisan perspective. And what we saw in the data does actually, validate what the Restaurant Association is saying. We've seen a disproportionate drop-off in spending at restaurants compared to other spending categories. And especially when we look at June onward, right? When we look at the second half of the year, we see a reversal of the trend of the first half of the year, right? People are starting to tighten their belts. So that could be like, for example, like households who took the fork got closer to the retirement date and maybe like didn't have a new gig yet. They may have tightened up their spending. But we see a disproportionate drop off that is specific to the District of Columbia. And, what was going on in the third quarter of the year that was specific to the District of Columbia was the National Guard deployment and federal law enforcement surge.
That ended. At least it ended as a high-profile thing. But then it moved, Washington moved right into this period of government shutdown when a lot of federal workers were suddenly not getting paychecks and were understandably worried that they might never get those paychecks because there was talk of not making them whole at the end. And I think we started to see the bite of large numbers of undocumented people being removed and therefore not, going to the grocery store. Is it any of that showing up in your data? And if it isn't yet, when do you anticipate it?
The data set that we analyzed ran through September. And so the impacts of the government shutdown, we haven't yet analyzed those. That I think will come, and we will do that in a future analysis. Just looking at Q3, which is when the National Guard deployment and the federal law enforcement surge began in a really high-profile way, we do see this really disproportionate drop, and we actually see the drop strengthening over time. That deployment began in August, but the drop, the 2024 to 25 drop, is actually bigger in September than it was in August. So that deployment is not something that people became accustomed to. It's not something that people accepted. It's not something that people got used to. The residents of the DC metro area responded to that deployment by spending less money in the district.
All right. So I think it is pretty reasonable to think, like, if you look at your neighbor and your neighbor is suddenly spending less, not going to the store as much, not going out as much, it's reasonable to think like my neighbor is, has problems, is worried or has lost a job or something like that. Looking at this data set writ large, I guess I'll just ask you the question that economists hate being asked, which is how screwed are we?
The interesting thing is that, we look, the District of Columbia, the chief financial officer, reports, real data about how revenue for the District of Columbia is doing. And so far, sales tax revenue is actually outperforming the CFO's projections. They have revised their consumer forecasts, the revenue estimates down for what they're expecting in the future from sales taxes. And so revising downward is going to minimize any unexpected negative impact that can come from negative variances. What we haven't seen yet is this actually having an impact on the city's ability to raise revenue to provide services. Right now, the impact is still in kind of at that first order impact of directly on the businesses themselves.
In the first week of the year, Compass Coffee, the local chain, announced it was going into Chapter 11. And what they said is that their neighborhood stores are doing okay, but their downtown stores never recovered from work from home during the pandemic. I think people get obsessed about the health or non-health of restaurants, partly because they like food, but also because there's fewer and fewer things that you have to be physically there to buy. We lost a lot of our clothes stores or hardware stores or whatever a long time ago. The restaurants are still there. When you see something like the coffee store blaming downtown's desolation for its troubles, is that like a barometer we should take seriously?
I think it's a very real phenomenon. I do a lot of research on the topic of what's going on with downtowns. This has been a big focus area for me for the past few years, much bigger than my DMV project. And there is a structural and I think sticky shift in demand for downtowns. And that means that downtowns need to adapt. It is really challenging for downtown DC in particular to adapt because the federal government is such a major landowner and employer in the downtown. If they're not at the table as a nimble, flexible partner, and the federal government is not famous for its nimbleness or flexibility, then that is going to put downtown DC at a real disadvantage relative to other downtowns in retooling to a new demand reality.
And so on that point, let's put this in the context of other downtowns, because, Los Angeles or New York or whatever they're also in the United States, and presumably overseas visitors who are wary of the United States are also going to be wary of those cities. How has spending been in other markets? Is Washington an outlier here, or are we seeing something else?
There isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all answer to that, because my understanding
I only
is
like
that
one-size-fits-all answers.
My understanding is that West Coast cities are still below pre-pandemic in terms of visitation and spend in their downtowns. New York, however, I think is now above the pre-pandemic level, and really demonstrates that if we don't want to call it recovery, that resilience and adaptation and thriving in the future are totally possible.
All right, so let's pivot off that optimistic note. What do you got next? This DMV Monitor is an ongoing project, and I know you are constantly looking for interesting and illustrative data. What do you got?
So when we put out our last update, we also updated all of the metrics that we had previously measured and analyzed in our first report. And one thing that really jumped out at me is that the DMV is now the number one major metro market in the United States for the number of active home sale listings, which I'm not sure has ever happened before. There are more homes for sale in the DMV right now than there are in Vegas.
So what does this tell you?
So I think it raises more questions than it answers. We want to know where people go when they're selling their home. And so we've obtained a pretty unique data set from the U.S. Postal Service that we hope is going to help us answer that question, and that'll be coming next time.
Oh my God, we've got to have her back immediately. But Tracey, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. And become a CityCast DC neighbor. You can do it at membership.citycast.fm. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.